Yeah, still morning. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to sort of like give sort of like a brief overview of what we expect to do within the Khakhea Bray transboundary aquifer. I think Kudzai has sort of like provided a brief like overview of where the Khakhea Bray transboundary aquifer occurs. So it occurs between two countries, which is South Africa and Botswana, and within the South African context, it's found within the Northwest province. And so, yeah, we have been there now 3 times, Farai and myself, and what is interesting from those 3 different trips that we have sort of like conducted to the area is that we now sort of like believe that most of the groundwater dependent ecosystems are located within the Khakhea Bray dolomite system. And as we move away from the Khakhea Bray dolomite system, you tend to get ponds or wetland systems that are dependent on rainfall. But we still need to sort of like verify that using GIS and other tools such as geohydrology. And the other thing from the South African context that we managed to observe was that most of these groundwater dependent systems were located sort of like on the southern tip of the Khakhea Bray dolomite system around the Morokweng area, around the Morokweng. So this is a video that Adam took when we visited in June recently. It's just trying to highlight the diversity of the ponds, or the number of ponds that can exist within a small area. So this is around Morokweng. And this area where you are seeing these ponds, so it was a transitional, it's sort of like a transitional zone between the communal areas here. Then you have this transitional area where these ponds occur, and then you have the commercial farms. So within the commercial farms, you don't get much of these ponds existing anymore, because most of the farmers they tend to sort of like destroy these ponds. But within the communal areas, especially where there are no households, what we managed to find out was that these groundwater dependent ecosystems sort of like exist. So this area sort of like provides an interesting study area for us to answer a lot of questions that are related to the aquatic biodiversity of these systems. So the GIS guys, they're mostly focusing on the sort of like the terrestrial biodiversity element, and then then there is the aquatic guys who are mostly focusing on the dynamics that exist within these individual ponds. So just a brief introduction why wetland biodiversity matters. As we know that wetlands, they play an important role for climate regulation, and it has been observed that 30% of the land-based carbon is stored within peatlands. And then also they play a role in purifying our water. We know that the plants that exist within wetland ecosystems, they absorb most of the pollutants that enter the system. And when the water leaves the wetland system, it's relatively clean. And then in other areas, they create jobs, all right, through recreational activities. And it depends on what type of wetland ecosystem one is focusing on. So for the ponds, yeah, that might be slightly different. And then And then these wetland systems, they provide billions of dollars to economies. And so it is important to highlight that the loss of wetlands generally results in the loss of biodiversity. So that is the case, especially if you go to the Khakhea Bray transboundary aquifer. If you visit the commercial farms, you will notice that there are no more wetland systems, and it means that the biodiversity that existed in those ponds is sort of like been lost. So in order for us to end all these biodiversity losses, we need to restore our wetlands, and we need to be able to better understand how these different wetland ecosystems function. Why we care about groundwater, I think James managed to highlight why these systems are really important. And I think James also had a similar slide to this one. Hence, I won't go into much detail, but it is important to highlight that these systems, they play an important role in our everyday lives, and especially in the communities within the Khakhea Bray transboundary aquifer, because what we realize is that most of the farmers, because that area is sort of like a water stressed area, so most of the farmers they depend on groundwater for irrigation purposes of their potatoes that they grow within the region. And also the local communities, they depend also on groundwater for their livelihoods. So this fig is just trying to highlight how groundwater plays an important role in sort of like discharging this graph is trying to show how groundwater plays an important role in sustaining wetland ecosystems. So what happens is that, especially during the summer season, the water table sort of like increases. As the water table increases, groundwater is discharged into these groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then these groundwater dependent ecosystems, they then sustain the biodiversity that occurs within them. And also, while I'm at this slide, it is important to highlight that within the Khakhea Bray transboundary aquifer system, most of the groundwater dependent systems are wetland ponds. There are no river systems that we observed. So most of the systems are wetland ponds, and which depend on this groundwater. And like I've highlighted before, most of them are located on the southern tip of the Khakhea Bray dolomite system. So as we move away from the Khakhea Bray dolomite system, the groundwater dependent ecosystem sort of like fall off, because the reason why they fall off is that the groundwater table within that region around Morokweng is relatively higher compared to the other regions that are found within the Khakhea Bray transboundary system. A few 100 kilometers from Morokweng, you realize that the groundwater table is around 100 meters. So that can easily tell you that the ponds that exist in that area, they are not a groundwater dependent system. So this study, in essence, will help us to understand how groundwater plays an important role in sustaining the biodiversity within these ponds. So this fig is just trying to show a schematic outline of a typical wetland cycle. So this is also a typical cycle that we expect to find within the Khakhea Bray transboundary system. So what happens is that most of the times when it rains, your pan sort of like fills up, and the filling up sort of like varies across seasons. So in one season, your pan can be half full, all right, and then that results in a relatively shorter hydro period. So when the hydro period is shorter, so it means that the animals and the plants that live within that pond, they need to emerge and reproduce and die off within that narrow window. And then when it dries out, one can easily go and collect sediment within these ponds and assess for the biodiversity that might exist within this pond, because most of the taxa that exist within wetland ecosystems, they tend to produce resting stages that can survive during these dry phases. But there are other years when an area can receive relatively good rains. So when an area receives relatively good rains, it means that the hydro period, the time in which a wetland system has water is prolonged, and it means that also the diversity that might exist within that pan tends also to increase because of this prolonged period of wetting. And also what is important to highlight is that surface runoff and rainfall and groundwater plays also an important role in sustaining these temporal cycles. So these are cycles that we have observed working in the Eastern Cape and in Botswana with Ryan. And so, we expect, and other colleagues around the world have also observed these kind of cycles. And then if you look at how do the communities sort of like change across a hydro period, what we have observed is that when the wetland first fills, you tend to get wetland specialists such as your triops, your paradiaptomid copypods, you get your larger cladocerans, and you also get your fairy shrimp. And then a few weeks into your wetland filling, your amphibians start to immigrate and they reproduce. And then with time, your wetland specialists, they sort of like fall off because of the predation pressure that is increasing within this wetland pond. But as the pond starts to dry out, you see that the predatory insects start to dominate within these wetland systems, and your frogs sort of like start moving away or start to sort of like hibernate. And towards the latter end of your hydro period, some of the wetland specialists, they come back and you start seeing them. So this is a similar process that we have so far observed within the Khakhea Bray transboundary system. So last year, when we visited ponds within the Morokweng area, what we observed that fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp tended to dominate, and we did not see any other form of invertebrates. And there were a few species of frogs, such as the bullfrog and one or two other species. But 6 months down the line, when we visited, we didn't see any frog. That was during the winter months. And then the ponds were mostly dominated by the generalist invertebrates, taxa. So taxa that are not sort of like unique to wetland systems. So, and all these wetland specialist species or taxa that are unique to wetland systems, they were sort of like absent from these systems. So their absence could have been related to a predation pressure that occurred, that could have occurred during the 6 months period when we were away. So we expect to observe this sort of like dynamics as we visit these ponds more and more often, and the way that we are planning our field trips to the Khakhea Bray is that they sort of like try to correspond to the rainfall patterns and also periods in between the summer season, and also have the dry sort of like the dry periods when the ponds will be dry, so that we can be able to collect some sediment that we can analyze for the different taxa that might exist within these ponds. So as similar to what Kudzai highlighted from his preliminary results, is that what one observed around the ponds is that there is generally a high biodiversity that occurs. So that finding already is very much interesting, because we know from literature and also from studies that these wetland ponds, they are considered areas of high biological diversity. So we expect to find that the diversity that exists in these ponds will be greater, but as one move away, the diversity sort of like decreases. And then also the other element that results in this high biodiversity is because it's related to the fact that most terrestrial taxa, they tend to use these systems for their sort of like everyday lives, and also for their breeding. So it depends on which species you are looking at. So within the biodiversity component, we have several institutions that are leading the biodiversity component. We have the Aquatic Systems Research Group that is based at the University of Venda and University of Mpumalanga, and the Wetland Ecology Lab at Rhodes University. So those are the two sort of like leading institutions for the biodiversity component. And then we have the University of the Western Cape and Venda that will play an important role, especially on the spatial analysis of the identified taxa within these wetland systems. So I think James highlighted some of the key members for the different groups. So the biodiversity component is led by me, and with the support of Professor Ryan Wasserman, and we also have Adam and Chad. So Adam is a microbiologist who's assisting with the microbial elements and DNA quantification of the biodiversity within the wetland system. And then Chad is looking at the reptiles, particularly frogs that might exist within these systems. And then we have Farai and Timothy. So these are the GIS guys who are playing an important role, who play an important role in the spatial analysis of the distribution of the different taxa that will identify across the Khakhea Bray transboundary systems. So they will help they will help with the production of the distribution maps for the key species. And then we have one PhD student, Chipo. Chipo is looking at plankton diversity and also looking at food web structure across different ponds within the Khakhea Bray transboundary system. So he has roughly 20 ponds on the South African side, and he's going to get another a similar number for the Botswana side. So he's going to tell us how the food web structure sort of like varies, and how does each biodiversity taxa fit into the food web within these groundwater dependent systems. Then we have two MSc students, that is Fanny and Frank. So Fanny is looking at the invertebrate diversity that exists within these ponds, and Frank is looking at the microbial diversity, and also trying to use the DNA to quantify the diversity that exists within these GDEs. And Adam is assisting Frank with that, and then Chad, the postdoctoral fellow, will look at the amphibian biodiversity that exists within the ponds. So the key aims for the biodiversity section is to document the important plant and animal species that exist within the ponds. So this will sort of like help us with the identification of keystone species for conservation priority. We know that there are some interesting species, especially if you look at the larger brachiopods. All right, your tadpole shrimp, your fairy shrimp, your clam shrimp. So it will be interesting to see whether there are any new species or unique species that exist within that region. And then it will also help us to identify hotspots where management intervention should be focused on. So these could be the groundwater dependent systems where groundwater mining is taking place, hence affecting the integrity of the system. And then another key and important element is that of capacity building through student training. So for this component, we have 3 students, 1 PhD and 2 MSc students. And then if you look at the working plan, so this table is just trying to highlight the activity, outputs, and expected outcomes for the different component, for the different activity aims that we intend to do. So if you look at the first activity, is characterizing the species that exist within the selected GDEs. So for the species here, we'll mostly focus on the plants. All right, so plants that exist within the ponds, and plants that exist outside or within the terrestrial environment immediately out of the ponds. So then the outputs is the ecological and biodiversity surveys at the identified GDEs, then database of the data collected during the surveys, then outcome data on biodiversity at the selected groundwater dependent ecosystems available to the public through the SADC GIP and other global repository databases. And then activity 2, it aims at determining the relationship between the species and groundwater dynamics. So if you remember that cycle that I sort of like showed you that indicated how the biodiversity sort of like changes across an entire hydro period. So we'll try to relate that the diversity that will exist and the water that will exist within the ponds, and try to relate it to the changes that will be occurring in the water table, to see whether groundwater is playing an important role in sustaining the pond itself. So then the output will be to report on the ecological or groundwater interactions, whereby we will look at the cause and effect relationship. Then the outcomes will be the research publications available through the SADC Gray Literature Archive, and also through several international journals, and also the promotion of an understanding of the ecological role of groundwater. Then number 3 is the identification of species and ecological communities of conservation concern relying on groundwater status. I think I've indicated that we think within the large brachiopods, and also within the amphibians, there might be some species of interest, particularly if you think the amphibians, the African bullfrog is found within that area. And if you look at the amphibians, we're talking about the tadpole shrimp, or the fairy shrimp, or the clam shrimp. We might get some interesting taxa there. And then the outputs, it's groundwater dependent ecosystems, or species are most dependent on groundwater, will be identified. And then the outcomes, hotspots for the GDEs identified and prioritized for interventions. And then the other outcome is research publications available through the SADC Gray Literature Archive. So this will be sort of like open access for everyone. And then the last one, working with the GIS guys now, is to develop a spatial database of the species biodiversity within the Khakhea Bray transboundary system. So the output will be through the biodiversity surveys completed and data captured into a database, and then the outcomes, biodiversity data set readily available to the public through the SADC GIP data, which is an open source link that is freely available to the public. So there are some key deliverables. So 2 of them they've already been done, which was the literature review and the proposal for the biodiversity component, which was submitted early this month to JRS. So the next deliverable will be in late December, early January, that will look at the preliminary results from the biodiversity component. Then we're going to have a stakeholder engagement workshop that will sort of like try to present the results and provide some inputs from the stakeholders. It's at the end of month 28, and then we have the draft final report for the biodiversity component at the end of month 30. So this one will incorporate the inputs from the stakeholder engagement. And then the final deliverable report submitted to JRS at the end of month 33. And then within that time, we expect all our master students to have completed, but the PhD student will be sort of like 2.5 years into her studies, and then he will complete 6 months after that the project has been finalized. Thank you.